Our scripture reading today is Psalm 139, 1 through 14. Search me, O God, and know my heart. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. For you have formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. This is the word of the Lord.
The psalmist declared, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. About the time that Darwin came out with his theory of evolution, there was another scientist contemporary with Darwin by the name of A.R. Wallace, who came out with a theory of natural selection almost identical to Darwin's theory. And in fact, it was A.R. Wallace who, writing in the literature, the scientific literature of the day, coined the term Darwinism. Darwin's teachings he referred to as Darwinism. Darwin wrote back and he said to A.R. Wallace, he said, why do you call this Darwinism when you might just as well call it Wallaceism? But Wallace said there was one area that he could not agree with Darwin on, that he had to take issue with what Darwin was saying. And that was when it comes to the existence of the human brain. Wallace said that the human brain is so marvelous, it is so intricate, it is so unique, it could never have just happened. That there had to be a designer to design that brain. And of course, we know that God designed it. And David even realized that God has a special interest in us for some reason, because David says, no matter where I go, I descend into the depths or I ascend to the heights, wherever I am, there you are. God does have a definite interest in us because we're designed in his image. And so I want to talk a little bit this morning from a spiritual perspective about the design of that brain that God made. You see, the brain, where is it? Well, that's easy. It's inside this protective covering that's called the skull. Your skull protects that brain. What does it do? Now, that's a little more difficult question. This organ, when unimpaired, allows you to remember and reminisce, to ponder and meditate, to invent and solve, to daydream and to retrace, to plot and to scheme, to envision and to celebrate. You see, on the fourth day after conception, the brain begins to form. It begins to develop. An organ that can hold 1,000 times more information than a 20-volume encyclopedia. This human brain is the most complex and inscrutable object in all of creation. Medical science is only today beginning to fathom and understand its secrets. And what medical science doesn't know about the brain still far exceeds what we do know about the brain. Your brain, in fact, is an amazing 3-pound universe. It's a universe of infinite possibilities and mystery. It constantly shapes and reshapes itself as a result of the experiences that you go through. The brain is the organ and instrument of the mind, and it controls the whole body. Now, I find that interesting because I found that quotation in the writings of Ellen White in Christian Home, page 586, third paragraph. Kirk talked a little bit in Sabbath school this morning about what Ellen White wrote, the many writings of Ellen White that has guided our church in the formation of our church. And by the way, Kirk, I'm sure you're aware that the Smithsonian Institute has named Ellen White as one of the 100 top most influential individuals in the development of the United States. Her writing, she is the most prolific female writer in America. And I have never felt more that she was inspired than when I studied the research about the brain. Because this is just one of many quotations where she wrote in a day when they did not understand that much about the brain. She wrote things that today medical science is verifying. Dan Siegel, in his book on the developing mind, says that the mind emerges from the activity of the brain, whose structure and function are directly shaped by interpersonal experience. There's been a discussion in the academic community. Is the mind and the brain two separate things, or are they one and the same? And there are two groups of individuals. There's one group who says the mind and the brain, same thing. Another group says no, the mind and the brain are two separate things. I was flying on an airplane one day. Don't remember where I was going, but I was reading on the plane a book about the mind and the brain. The whole focus of the book was on the separateness of the two and how they intermingle. There was a group of college kids on this flight, probably a dozen or so. And after the flight got up and we're on our way, reached the height we were going and so on, these kids they're all up like college kids normally would be, and running up and down the aisles and having a big time visiting with their friends. The seat next to me, for some reason, was empty. I think someone had gotten up and left. And one of the college girls came in. She popped down in the seat next to me, and she said, "What are you reading?" I didn't expect a college kid to be interested in that particular book I was reading, but I told her a little bit about it. And she said, "What do you believe? Do you believe they're one and the same, or do you believe they're separate?" I was a little surprised. She knew the topic. She knew something about what we were talking about. I said, "Well, I believe they're two separate things. I believe the brain and the mind are two separate things. I said, what do you believe? She said, oh, I'm a dualist. And then she's up and running down the aisle again of the plane, visiting with her friends. But that gave me confidence in the current generation. I think we have some hope there. And I find that interesting because obviously from the quotation that Ellen White wrote, the brain is the organ and the instrument of the mind and controls the whole body. The mind is larger than the brain. The brain is the organ, but the mind encompasses the entire body. And you have more receptors in the bottom of your foot than you have in your brain. So any place in your body that you have receptors, that is part of your mind. We know from brain research that information is stored in networks. As the neurons fire, they become part of a network. The researchers say that the neurons that fire together wire together. And so these networks develop, and eventually the adult human brain becomes this particular thicket of connections. Estimates are that it takes about a quadrillion connections. Quadrillion, that's 1,000 trillion. Sounds like talking about the national debt, doesn't it? To wire this adult brain, about a quadrillion connections. And the number of possible on and off patterns of neuronal firing is 10 to the 1 millionth power. 10 times 10, 1 million times. It's a pretty large number. Well, what are some of the primary assailants to this brain? If we're going to take care of the brain that God created and made for us, we need to understand a little something about it. What are some of the primary assailants? Some of the things we ought to be careful about when we're dealing with our brain. Medication is one of them. Medication is needed, obviously, at certain times, but we should be careful not to take more than we need because medication can be an assailant to the neurons in the brain. Disease, especially heart disease. Now, why would heart disease especially be detrimental to the neurons? Well, the heart pumps the blood that circulates to the brain that carries the oxygen to the brain. So if the heart is not pumping properly, you're not getting the proper oxygen to the brain. Extended grief over personal loss. We all experience this personal loss from time to time. And it is important that we go through the grieving process when we have a personal loss. But it is also important that we, in that grieving process, that we get over it and not extend it, because if we extend that grieving process too long, it becomes detrimental to the neurons in our brain. Alcohol, I don't think we need to comment too much about that. That's, we know, and from our temperance programs. A sedentary lifestyle, which we very much have in our country today. A lack of stimulation. A lack of curiosity and a desire to learn. If we lack that, we need that curiosity to keep the brain active and to keep it growing. Malnutrition. And you might say, well, in America we don't have that. Well, unfortunately we do. We have a lot of that in America. And it is something that we need to be careful about. And depression is an assailant to the neurons. If you took a piece of your brain the size of a grain of sand, a little bit, size of a grain of sand, in that little piece of your brain, there would be 100,000 neurons. There would be 2 million axons, and there would be 1 billion synapses. Now, I didn't count those, but some scientists did somewhere. And I have to have a little faith in them and take that, because how long would it take you to count 100,000 neurons? It'd probably take quite a while, because you have to do it under the microscopic and so on. Michael Gurian wrote a book, How Boys and Girls Learn Differently. And it's a very interesting book, and boys and girls do learn differently. The male brain and the female brain are not exactly the same. There are differences. We need to understand that in order to understand each other. And so Michael Gurian was asked the question, how does the brain actually work? Well, our answer to that question is far more complete than it was a couple of decades ago, but it's still a long way from being finished. Because you might just as well attempt to fully describe how the planet works, or how the solar system works, or how the universe works, for the brain is no less complex. I said at the beginning, the brain is a 3-pound universe. And it is as complex as a universe. It's fascinating, as mysterious as are all these other things. It's a very exciting topic. It's a very exciting study about. The number of permutations and combinations of activity theoretically that are possible in the brain exceeds the number of elementary particles in the universe. So truly the brain is a 3-pound universe. I wanted to share something with you that I found very interesting in some of my research. I haven't known about this for too long. It's been a while now. But I want to share with you the little brain in the heart. I've always thought that the heart is a metaphor for the brain. Because the Bible talks a lot about the heart. And if you look here's in my concordance, it's got just a whole list that starts here and goes way down, a whole list of texts talking about the heart, and such things as each man whose heart prompts him. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Love your God with all your heart. And it goes on and it says, write these things on your heart. It refers to things, and I said, that's got to be talking about the brain. So the heart is being used as a metaphor for the brain. But then there was discovered some research that changed my mind on that. That actually the Bible is talking about the brain in the heart. So there's this is a microscopic picture here showing the interconnectivity between cardiac ganglia in the human heart. If you look at the light blue thin structures on the left, there are multiple axons that are coursing between them, connecting the ganglia. And that image on the right is an expanded view of what is in the little rectangular box there on the left. That picture, my notes here. This is a highly magnified view of a cardiac intrinsic ganglia that was taken with a confocal microscope. Confocal microscope will take the image a slice at a time, and it'll build a 3D image of it. And so this was built through the confocal microscope. And it gives us, shows us the groups of nerve cells called the somata that exist outside of the brain and the spinal cord. And each of the smaller circular structures there shown in this cell body is that of an individual neuron. Here we have the image representing a cross section of an intrinsic cardiac ganglion. And in the center of that, you will find this mass of dendrites, which connect individual neurons. This is the ideal structure for an independent neural processing unit. So it's actually processing down here instead of up here. Here we have a diagram showing how the openings, how the intrinsic cardiac ganglia tends to cluster around the larger openings, the orifices in the heart. And some of the largest connections in the body are between the heart and the brain. And this is a intrinsic cardiac afferent neuron taken with a confocal microscope. Different neuron, an afferent neuron is one that sends information to another neuron. So they communicate with each other. They're sending information. And so they detect if there's local mechanical or biochemical changes that are occurring in the tissue. They're sending that information to the rest of the intrinsic cardiac nervous systems, and in many cases they're sending the information to the brain. And so that communication is going on. So in reality, when the Bible speaks of as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, you actually think in your heart. And other parts of the body. It's interesting, we have a nephew who has actually had 2 heart transplants. He had a heart transplant and he had problems with it. But after about 10 or 15 years, they had to replace it and they did a second heart transplant. And he's doing so much better with his second heart transplant. It was interesting that after he had the first heart transplant, we were visiting with him, and we had gone to a restaurant that morning for breakfast. And as we're eating, Kevin had ordered this big glass of chocolate milk. And as we're eating breakfast, he looked at me and he kind of laughed. He said, you know, he said, whose ever heart I got must have liked chocolate milk. Because he said, I never liked chocolate milk until I had this heart transplant, and now I have to have a glass every day. So I try to remind people, if you're going to be an organ donor, be careful how you live. Because some of those things may come out in that organ you donate to someone else. Unfortunately, that heart had picked up a lot of other habits that weren't the best that translated to Kevin also. And he's doing so much better now with the new heart. And of course, in the resurrection, God's going to give him a new heart that will not have any of those imperfections. The 6 main paths to the brain, you will recognize, of course, as our senses. What we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we touch, what we smell. What we do has an effect. Everything we do has an effect on the brain. And also what we imagine, what we intuit, and what we feel. I want to talk a little bit about a term that is a recent term, and that is the plasticity of the brain. The human brain can change over time. It can change over your whole lifespan. Whether you're in the womb, whether you're 5 years of age, whether you're 80 years of age, or whether you're 110 years of age, the brain can be shaped and molded and nurtured. And by the way, this young lady in the bottom picture here, in the picture there, that was taken on her 110th birthday. So, yes, it is possible to live those years. In fact, it is very possible in this 21st century now for an individual to live beyond 100 years of age. We have a number of centenarians today that are alive and doing very well. Neuroplasticity is a term that is becoming better recognized, certainly in the academic community, but also in the layperson community. Neuroplasticity is not like the plastic bumper on your car. That's not what we're talking about. It's referring to a brain that is highly dynamic. It's constantly reorganizing and malleable. In other words, it can be shaped, and one way it can be shaped is by the environment that it is put into. Let me just say a word about it. I want to show you a little video clip to show you how plastic the brain is, how changeable it is. The individual in this video is a little girl who had a disease called Rasmussen's encephalitis. Rasmussen's encephalitis affects only one side of the brain. It can be the left hemisphere, it can be the right hemisphere. But it affects the entire hemisphere. And the only cure for it is to remove that diseased half of the brain. This surgery was performed by Dr. Ben Carson, well known to Seventh-day Adventists. And you will see how plastic the brain is, how the brain can adjust, and how it can make up for the missing parts.
3, Cinderella!
We are beginning to harness the brain's incredible ability to invent itself, then reinvent itself throughout life. This girl is a testament to the amazing resilience of the human brain. Young Jody Miller leads an idyllic life as a 9-year-old girl. You would never guess that she has undergone some of the most drastic surgery imaginable.
Happy birthday.
Jody's first 3 years were textbook normal.
Happy birthday, dear Jody.
Then, about 6 weeks after her 3rd birthday, a storm of epileptic seizures took control of her brain.
She couldn't use her left arm hardly at all. She could barely use the left leg, seizing a good deal of the time, multiple types of seizures.
Ordinary life became impossible. Medicines did nothing, and the seizures threatened to turn fatal. Desperate, Jody's parents brought her to pediatric neurologist Eileen Vining.
We found her seizures were all coming from her right hemisphere. And we knew that there is virtually nothing else, nothing but Rasmussen syndrome that can produce that picture in a young child.
Rasmussen syndrome is a degenerative brain disorder that disrupts the electrical activity that makes our brains work. Tiny electrical explosions were flaring up in Jody's right hemisphere. As seizures became almost constant, she lost control of her left side. Only one radical treatment option remained.
We knew that she was never going to have her seizures controlled with medicine, and we knew that she and her family faced taking out that half of the brain.
Okay.
Dr. Vining recommended a daring surgery called a hemispherectomy. It would be performed by pediatric neurosurgeon Ben Carson.
The whole concept of taking out half of a person's brain would seem to most people impossible. Human beings are incredible creatures with a brain that is beyond belief in terms of its capabilities, to the point where we can take half of it out and still function in a normal way.
85% of our brain consists of the cerebral cortex, which is divided into 2 hemispheres, each with 4 main lobes. The cortex handles many of our higher functions. Areas on both sides control thinking, movement, and sensation. But the right side controls our left side and vice versa. Jody would lose almost all of her right hemisphere, and the cavity would fill with cerebrospinal fluid. The operation has to be performed with great precision to avoid damaging the parts of the brain that control Jody's life functions, like heartbeat and breathing. surgery went flawlessly.
What we're looking at here is an image, an MRI, that was done on Jody after her surgery. And what it shows us is the fact that we removed her entire right hemisphere. And what we're able to see here is indeed her very normal left hemisphere and all the beautiful gyri of her cortex. And we can see right down the middle, the right hemisphere that was there is now replaced by fluid.
But how could Jody function normally with only one hemisphere? It's because of a miraculous ability of the brain called plasticity. Our brains can actually change shape, creating new connections between neurons or brain cells to replace lost or damaged ones. Jody's left brain started reconnecting almost immediately.
At least as good as this. And if I remember, he wore pink just like you. This young lady had half her brain removed, went home, I guess maybe 10 days later, and was already walking. She was ambulating. She was able to walk out of the hospital. And that's because her left hemisphere had such resilience, such plasticity. It was able to say, okay, something needs to move her left leg. Whoa. You gonna open it? Okay.
Jody continues to work on training her brain to overcome the slight paralysis in her left side.
But enough. Now that's very good. You need to do that stretching stuff, honey. You know that, don't you? Are you doing enough of it? I think so. Yeah. Atomic symptoms.
The human brain is just an awesome thing because every time I look at it, I say to myself, this is the thing that makes this person unique. It still is just such a wonderful thing to find a young person whose life now can move on, who's no longer having seizures, who's developing in a normal fashion. I take the good with the bad, and I say, this is a bad thing, potentially, that we have to do for an extremely good cause.
It's amazing. I can't imagine the parents sitting in the waiting room, waiting through that surgery. It's about a 13, 14-hour surgery, it's my understanding. There are 5 critical factors that define an enriched environment for a healthy brain. Now, I want to just mention those quickly, and then I want to mention a couple of things that has come out just recently in the research pertaining to some things we do today. The 5 areas: socialization, physical activity, spirituality, mental stimulation, and diet. In Hebrews, we're told, Paul gives us the admonition to not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. But let us encourage one another, he says, and all the more as you see that day approaching. Now, we're meeting together online. I'm not sure Paul had that in mind when he wrote that because it didn't have the online. But it is important that we meet together and that the church meets together. You know, one of my favorite Peanuts cartoons was in this particular cartoon, Lucy comes in and demands that Linus change the channel, threatening him with her fist if he didn't. And Linus says, what makes you think you can walk right in here and take over? These 5 fingers, says Lucy, individually they're nothing. But when I fold them together like this into a single unit, they form a weapon that is terrible to behold. What channel do you want? Asked Linus. And turning away, he looks at his fingers and he says, why can't you guys get organized like that? Well, the same is true with the church. You know, singularly, we're basically nothing. But together, we can form a weapon that is terrible for the devil to behold. We just need to get organized and do that. And we've been doing that at the Auburn Church. Thank God for that. Research tells us that human beings as they get older, if they isolate, they have a higher risk for dementia. And 50 to 70% of all dementia is Alzheimer's disease. So socialization, meeting together, is important. The physical. Why is physical activity important to the brain? Well, every time your heart beats, 25% of the blood that is coming out of that one heartbeat goes to the brain to nurture it with the oxygen that it's needing. If you walk on a regular basis 3 times a week, you are less likely to develop dementia than those that don't walk for exercise at all. Walking is absolutely one of the best exercises that you can do. You see, there's a variation in your walking. And it's that variation that makes it such a good exercise. No 2 steps that you take are ever the same. You may not realize that, but every step you take is somewhat different from the previous step. No 2 steps are ever the same. And anytime you're sending new information to the brain, as we're doing when we walk, each step is integrating those movements into that constantly changing whole. So it is constantly changing your brain with every step you take. So walking is absolutely one of the best exercises. Dr. John Rady is the Associate Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. He is very much into exercise. Dr. Rady did a project, a research project, in which he took individuals who were suffering from depression, and he treated 3 different groups of depressed individuals. In group number 1, he treated with medication only. Group number 2, he treated with a combination of medication and exercise. Group number 3, he treated with exercise only. And the results of this study, the group that had the best response was the group number 3, the exercise only, and they also had the least amount of going back into depression afterwards. So Dr. Rady talks about exercise gets us moving naturally, which stimulates the brain stem and gives us more energy, more passion, more interest, more motivation. He's written a book titled Spark, and if you're interested in this, it's an outstanding book. And one particular story he has in there. There is a school in Naperville, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. The PE teacher got a burden that students do personal physical fitness. He said, we can do the sports games out here, but your baseball team, you're only getting a certain few out there. Everyone else is sitting in the stands, and they're not getting the benefit of the exercise, only those participating in the actual sport. So he convinced the administration of his school there in Naperville to require 30 minutes of personal physical fitness of every student every day. And unless they had a doctor's prescription not to, they were required to do 30 minutes of personal physical fitness every day. He actually went out to corporations and got donations and got exercise equipment and so on. They equipped their gymnasium very well for personal physical fitness. In the book, he reports after they'd had this program going for a little while, they took their 8th grade class to take a internationally standardized test. It's the NTSS. It's the national test for mathematics and science. I can't remember exactly what each of the letters stand for, but it's a test that they give to the different nations who are scoring on that test. If you hear somebody say, well, Singapore came in 5th in the world in math, it's based on that test. United States came in 32nd or whatever. It's based on that test. And so they took their 8th grade class to take that particular test. That 8th grade class of Naperville, first of all, the national average for 8th grade is to have 30% obesity. That 8th grade class only had 3% obesity. They took these tests. They scored 5th in the world, just below Singapore in math, and they just scored number 1 in the world in science. The only thing they did differently was 30 minutes personal physical fitness every day. So you can't convince Dr. Rady that exercise is not important. Aerobic exercise, it has this positive impact on our entire range of depressive symptoms. Dr. Rady says if everyone knew that exercise worked as well as Zoloft, I think we could put a real dent in the disease. As a matter of fact, depression, this erosion of connections in your life, according to Dr. Rady, presents numerous cases of worldwide scientific research and studies that affirms these relationships of the exercise to the brain. And in Britain, doctors now use exercise as a first line of defense for depression, but it's vastly underutilized in the United States. You go to your doctor depressed in the United States, you go home with a Zoloft or some other prescription. You go in Britain, you go out with an exercise program that you have to go and do. And they'll think about the drugs later after the exercise doesn't take care of everything. Ellen White, again, in Patriarchs and Prophets, wrote, there is an intimate relationship between the mind and the body. And in order to reach a high standard of moral and intellectual attainment, the laws that control our physical being must be heeded. The spiritual environment. From research, we know that people that pray on a daily basis have an enhanced immune system. We need to be doing lots of praying during this coronavirus pandemic, but we also need to be doing lots of praying, period. We know from research that people who attend formal places of worship live longer and they report healthier, happier lives. We know that if you're in the hospital and you pray as part of your daily routine, the time of discharge will be sooner. That's been proven. Parade Magazine did a survey not too long ago, and they found that 95% of all physicians indicate that prayer is important in the overall well-being of their patients. You know, Isaiah wrote that God will bear us up like the wings of an eagle. We need to take advantage of that prayer system that He has put in place for us, for our own benefit, for our own health. Mental stimulation. We know from research that keeping the brain active lowers the risk of dementia, especially Alzheimer's disease. So what are some of the ways that we can stimulate the brain? Learning a second language promotes brain health by developing those new neural circuitry in the brain. American Sign Language is an especially brain health promoting language because you're not only using the mental, but you've got the physical movement also going with it. Reading on a daily basis. Public speaking. Writing. And if you write using your non-dominant hand, that's good for your brain also. So, sometime catch my wife and tell her that you want to see her write with her right hand because she's left-handed. But she can write with her right hand almost as well as she can with the left hand. But that's good cross-laterals to do those types of things. Travel, where you're coming in contact with novel, complex environment, new things, novel meaning new. Games and puzzles are good. Music is good. These are ways to stimulate the brain. And then diet. There's a whole new field called dietary neurosciences, a whole new field of study. This is some studies on how brain affects, food affects the brain. And they reveal how the diet affects the brain function. Let me just read a little bit of this study to you. They were imaging technology allows scientists to link what we eat to what and how we think. You know, after all, we are what we eat. Recent study uncovered evidence that the brain's biological mechanisms may contribute to significant public health challenges, such as obesity, diabetes, binge eating, and the allure of the high-calorie meal. Bill Clinton, former president of the United States, who went through a huge transformation after his heart attack and so on, changed his diet. The author of the China study had a huge impact on Bill Clinton and on how he changed his diet. Bill Clinton made this statement: as a former president of the United States, I have access to the absolute best health care and medical advice in the entire world. By choosing to adopt a plant-based diet for myself and giving up all meat and dairy so that I can enable my body to heal itself, I am broadcasting to the world that I do not believe that our government, the United States Department of Agriculture, is advising Americans what we should be eating in order to prevent or reverse over 80% of our diseases and shave $2 trillion off of our $2.7 trillion cost of health care. He goes on to say, we've all been eating the wrong food for our species since we were born, and our government has not told us the truth about that food, nor have our medical schools or our schools of nutrition, both of which are controlled by the industries that produce our food and our drugs. Dr. Campbell said it best in his book, The China Study. The entire system, government, science, medicine, industry, and media, promotes profits over health, technology over food, and confusion over clarity. Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement for a former president of our country to make. And why is it important? Because your brain cells need insulation and nourishment to speed those messages around your body. I want to, and I'll try to do this quickly, I want to mention two things that I read this week. Number one, are you tired of video conferencing? This might explain why. You know, there's a lot of video conferencing taking place right now. There's a new thing that is called Zoom fatigue. It's named after the video conferencing app, Zoom, that so many of your students are using right now. Well, it's interesting. So many people have noticed that they feel exhausted after conducting their work and their social life and so on Zoom and other apps. Instead of in person, they're online. So we're going to try to do both, Marty, Wednesday night with prayer meeting. We'll get those that get worn out and those that benefit. Instead of being in person, even though it's the same work, it's the same social interaction, why is that? What does it have to do with how the brain works? Well, it really does. Zoom fatigue is taxing the brain. And here's how that happens. Video calls seem an elegant solution to remote work, but they wear on the psyche in complicated ways. Jody Eichler-Levine finished teaching her class over the Zoom on April 15. That was just a couple of weeks ago. and she immediately fell asleep in the guest bedroom that is doubling as her office. She is a religion studies professor at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and she says that while teaching is always exhausting, she has never conked out like that before. Until recently, Jody was leading live classes full of people whose emotions she could easily gauge. Even as they navigated difficult topics such as slavery and the Holocaust that demand a high level of conversational nuance and empathy. Now, like countless people around the world, the COVID-19 pandemic has thrust her life into a virtual space. In addition to teaching remotely, she's been attending a weekly department happy hour, an arts and crafts night with friends, and a Passover Seder all over the video conferencing app Zoom. The experience is taking a toll. Get my throat cleared up here. It's almost like you're emoting more because you're just a little box on the screen, Jody says. She says, I'm just so tired. Well, many people are reporting that very same experience. It's earned its own slang term, Zoom fatigue, though it applies to Google Hangouts and Skype, FaceTime, any of the other video calling conference interfaces. Virtual interactions can be extremely hard on the brain. And I don't know that we've really taken that much thought to this with the distance learning programs. But now it's becoming quite evident that that virtual interaction is extremely hard on the brain. When humans communicate, they're communicating even when they're being quiet. They don't have to be talking to be communicating. You can watch a person's body language, and you can pick up on an awful lot of communication from that. So during an in-person conversation, the brain focuses partly on the words that are being spoken, but it also derives additional meaning from dozens of nonverbal clues, such as whether someone's facing you, or if they're slightly turned away, or if they're fidgeting while you're talking, or if they're inhaling quickly in preparation to interrupt you. These cues help paint a holistic picture of what is being conveyed and what's expected in response from the listener. Perceiving these cues come naturally to most of us. Takes little conscious effort to parse and can lay the groundwork for emotional intimacy. However, a typical video call impairs these ingrained abilities, requires sustained and intense attention to words instead. If a person is framed only like from their shoulders up, which is often the case, and by the way, I read a thing the other day where they said in department stores had noticed they've been selling a lot of tops, but not the rest of the outfit, because you only have to be dressed from the waist up, looking good when you're on the video conferencing. Of course, there's been a few mishaps where people didn't realize the camera was still on, and they would get up, and so it's created some interesting scenarios. But if the person's framed only from the shoulders up, possibility of viewing their hand gestures, their body language, that's all eliminated. And if the video quality is poor, you're not going to glean much from their minute facial expressions, because that's going to be dashed also. If someone's really dependent on those nonverbal cues, it can be a big drain not to have them. Prolonged eye contact has become the strongest facial cue readily available, and it can feel threatening or overly intimate if held too long. Another thing, the multi-person screens magnify this exhausting problem. Gallery view, where all meeting participants appear Brady Bunch style, challenges the brain's central vision. It's forcing it to decode so many people at once. No one comes through meaningfully, not even the speaker. engaged in numerous activities, but never fully devoting ourselves to focus on anything in particular. Psychologists call this continuous partial attention. Continuous partial attention. And it applies as much to virtual environments as it does to real ones. Think of how hard it would be to cook and read at the same time. That's kind of what multitasking your brain is trying and often failing to navigate in this group video chat. Group video chats become less collaborative. They're more like siloed panels in which only two people at a time talk while the rest are listening. Because each participant's using one audio stream and is aware of all the other voices, parallel conversations are impossible. If you view a single speaker at a time, you can't recognize how non-active participants are behaving, something you would normally pick up with peripheral vision. For some people, the prolonged split in attention creates a perplexing sense of being drained while having accomplished nothing. The brain becomes overwhelmed by unfamiliar excess stimuli while being hyper-focused on searching for nonverbal cues that it can't find. By contrast, however, there is another side to this that is interesting. And I won't say much about it other than this, but there's more we could say. The sudden shift to video calls has been a boon for people who have neurological difficulty with in-person exchanges, such as those with autism, who can become overwhelmed by multiple people talking. It has been good for them. Well, that's some of the very latest research. This was just put in print about 2 weeks ago. Also, about 2 weeks ago, came out in print another study about adult brain repairs. And as I read this, I realized that I remember when this actually began, even though it was put in print about 2 weeks ago in the book, or in the magazine Nature, it was reported on. This actually started about 20 years ago. I was at a conference in San Diego, California, Learning Brain Expo. And the announcement came through to the participants at the conference there. They had just realized or just discovered that the brain actually does produce new neurons. Those of you my age, you've got some unlearning to do, because we were taught in school that you're born with a certain number of neurons, that you never get any more, and those start dying from the time you're born. And so once they're gone, you don't get any more, but nature provided you with enough to last throughout your lifetime and so on. Well, that's not true. They have discovered that the brain does produce new neurons. And that announcement was made about 20 years ago, but they've continued now to study this. And what they have just published as an extension of this, when adult brain cells are injured, they revert to an embryonic state according to new findings published in the April 15, 2020 issue of Nature by researchers at University of California, San Diego School of Medicine, and colleagues elsewhere. That is interesting. That's important. And let's just build on that. The scientists report that in their newly adopted immature state, the cells become capable of regrowing new connections that, under the right conditions, can help to restore lost function. Repairing damage to the brain and spinal cord may be medical science's most daunting challenge. Until recently, relatively recently, it seemed an impossible task. I'm sure in your work, Lona, that, individuals who have this damage and can no longer walk and so on. And that has seemed to be an impossible task to help that. The new study lays out a transcriptional roadmap of regeneration in the adult brain. Using the incredible tools of modern neuroscience, molecular genetics, virology, and computational power, we were able for the first time to identify how the entire set of genes in an adult brain cell resets itself in order to regenerate. This gives us fundamental insight into how, at a transcriptional level, regeneration happens. The senior author of the study says. Dr. Trzynski is professor of neuroscience and director of the Translational Neuroscience Institute at the UC San Diego School of Medicine. They used the mouse model. Trzynski and his colleagues discovered that after injury, mature neurons in adult brains revert back to an embryonic state. Who would have thought, said Trzynski. Only 20 years ago, we were thinking of the adult brain as static, terminally differentiated, fully established, and immutable. That's what I was taught coming up. That, you know, it's there, and you got what you got, and as you lose it, you've just lost it. Well, that's not true. Dr. Fred Gage, president and professor at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, and he's an adjunct professor at UC San Diego and others, found that new brain cells are continually produced in the hippocampus and subventricular zone, replenishing these brain regions throughout life. But the work goes further than just those two. The brain's ability to repair or replace itself is not limited to just two areas. Instead, when an adult brain cell of the cortex is injured, it reverts at a transcriptional level to an embryonic cortical neuron. And in this reverted, far less mature state, it can now regrow axons if it is provided an environment to grow into. In my view, this is the most notable feature of this study and is downright shocking, he says. If you just pause and think for a minute of the implications of that and the implications that has to totally change people's lives for the positive, to provide an encouraging environment for regrowth. Trzynski and colleagues investigated how damaged neurons respond after a spinal cord injury. In recent years, researchers have significantly advanced the possibility of using grafted neural stem cells to spur spinal cord injury repairs and restore lost function, essentially by inducing neurons to extend axons through and across an injury site, reconnecting the severed nerves. Last year, for example, this multidisciplinary team that was led by Dr. Koffler, he's assistant professor in neuroscience, Trzynski and this Dr. Chen, professor of nanoengineering and a faculty member in the Institute of Engineering and Medicine at UC San Diego. They described using 3D printed implants to promote nerve cell growth in spinal cord injuries in rats, restoring connections and lost functions. That 3D printing is a relatively new technology and is tremendously interesting. Someday we'll have to explore that. Latest study produced a second surprise in promoting neuronal growth and repair. One of the essential genetic pathways involves the gene Huntington, it's abbreviated the HTT, which when mutated causes Huntington's disease, devastating disorder characterized by the progressive breakdown of nerve cells in the brain. Trzynski's team found that the regenerative transcriptome, the collection of messengers RNA molecules used by corticospinal neurons, is sustained by the HTT gene. In mice genetically engineered to lack the HTT gene, the spinal cord injuries showed significantly less neuronal sprouting and regeneration. While a lot of work has been done on trying to understand why Huntington mutations cause disease, far less is understood about the normal role of Huntington, Trzynski says. Our work shows that Huntington is essential for promoting repair of brain neurons. Thus, mutations in this gene would be predicated to result in a loss of the adult neuron to repair itself. This, in turn, might result in the slow neuronal degeneration that results in Huntington's disease. That's just been published in the last 2 weeks. Every day, the journals are coming out with new findings that they found on the brain. And I believe that the study of the brain is going to be something we can do throughout eternity in heaven, that we will never fully understand the magnitude, the limitations. There seem to be no limitations. Truly, your brain is a 3-pound universe. We need to understand about the brain. There was a recent Harris survey. It asked the question, what is the most important system you need to have health information about? And the answers to this survey were, number 1 was heart, number 2, diabetes, number 3, cancer, and number 7, more accurately, only 3% of the population of the United States has said that the most critical would be brain health. Only 3%. So just from being here in church this morning, you're ahead of 97%. You're in the 97, ahead of that 97% on understanding how the brain functions. And yet God created that. It's such an amazing thing. Brain health was right there with sensory functions like vision and hearing. Tells us how much we have to do to get people to understand the basics of their brain. That power which the brain we know to be neuroplasticity, and how we can engage ourselves in a lifelong process to promote the health of the brain. Truly, the psalmist says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. And we have a closing song by the Villarreal family.
One, two, three, four. Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Come on, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down, 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 down. You may talk about the men of Gideon, you may talk about the men of Saul, but there's none like good old Joshua at the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Come on, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Down, 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 down.
Let's bow our heads for prayer. Father, we thank you for this time we've had together. We thank you for the wonderful creation that you made man and woman to be. And I pray that you will help us to live up to its fullest potential, to take care of these wonderful creations you made, the parts of our body that need to function as a whole, to glorify you and to finish this work so Jesus can come. And we can go home and be with you in heaven throughout eternity. We can study these things forever. Be with us now as we go our separate ways. Bless us until we meet again. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.